I'd like to start by asking you to take maybe 5 minutes or so and give us some background on who you are and how you come to be where you are and what's driving your work, inside view.
Okay, let me start by indicating that my mother was a kindergarten teacher and also a reading tutor, and as a young high school student, I worked with students that were experiencing different sorts of reading failure, more as a sort of male support figure than anything else. When I was in graduate school, I got interested in working with students who were experiencing reading failure, and I was involved with one of the larger scale national efforts to examine how we could improve the performance of students in low-income communities. At the same time, I was also becoming credentialed as a school psychologist, and after that started to work in the public schools and became very quickly aware of the very important dynamic that goes on between academic performance and emotional and behavioral functioning in children, and got very interested in seeing what I could do both on an individual level for specific children and systemically to try to reduce rates of reading failure and help children feel more successful from the very outset.
One of the things that we particularly want to draw out in your beginning is helpful. I want to get more detail on has to do with the correspondence between how children feel about themselves, how they feel about their minds, and reading. In other words, we often think of reading all of the good things that it enables, but there's another side of it, which is what happens to children that struggle too long with it in terms of how it's affecting who they are and how they feel about how they're functioning.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit, both as somebody that's worked with children that are having substantial difficulty in school, and also as someone that's taught children and taken them through part of the reading process. As part of my training, I did quite a bit of instructional work in reading, not primarily in the classroom, but more small group focused instruction that was in a research setting, but was involved with youngsters in the very early stages of reading. I think one of the things that anybody that spends any time in a classroom becomes quickly aware of is that there are lots of things going on in classrooms that tell kids just how important reading is. There are lots of things that are print-driven. There are materials, there are instructions, there's the amount of time during the day that's given to reading, there are all the books that are all over the place. There's also the very obvious excitement of kids that are progressing normally and doing well. And all of these things, I think, tend to deliver a pretty powerful message to the child that's struggling that's very threatening and frightening, that you're not progressing as other kids are, you're not learning, you're not unlocking this great mystery. We have all of these words on the board, words on posters, words on papers, words in books. Everywhere a kid turns in school, they're confronted with print. And if you see yourself being excluded from the process of becoming familiar with this, learning how it works, taking pleasure in it, being excited about being able to be autonomous and independent, then I think that's a very potent emotional message that children get, and potentially a very damaging one. And it's difficult sometimes to pick this apart empirically, but certainly, again, spending any amount of time in classrooms where children are working on beginning reading instruction, you can almost watch children who are struggling begin to turn off and exhibit behaviors that are going to interfere with their learning, beginning to develop these sort of defensive postures, Sometimes it looks like inattentiveness. Sometimes it looks like I don't care. Sometimes it looks like I'm interested in anything but this. So it can take a lot of different forms. But nonetheless, you can see kids trying to do whatever it is they need to do to protect themselves in that situation. Because none of us are comfortable being one down all the time. And if you're not learning to read, you're being left behind in probably the single most important process that occurs in early schooling. Because it's the key to everything else that occurs. And when you can't read, you're lost the rest of the day. It's not just during reading time. You're also lost during all of the other times, except perhaps PE and recess, which might account for their popularity with some kids. But, nonetheless, just very, very critical. And even though sometimes, we might look at kids and say, gee, I wish they valued this more. I wish they were more, motivated to learn. And actually, I think many of them are. They're just frightened. Failure is pretty terrifying at that level and not something to be taken lightly. So.
Excellent. Drilling into that a little bit, I mean, the fear is of the shame.
Yes.
Right? And human beings generally tend to want to avoid things that bring about feelings of shame.
Absolutely. So a lot of the behaviors that I described just a few minutes ago, essentially you can look at as attempts to avoid situations where you're going to be compared, negatively to other children, even just by yourself. I don't want to, imply that teachers are going around intentionally shaming kids, but it's clear that they develop a sense of shame around their lack of capacity. And again, this manifests in lots and lots of different ways. Disinterest, defiance, inattentiveness. Those aren't the difficulties with reading. It's not the only reason for those sorts of behaviors, but it explains probably a surprising amount of it, actually considering the difficulty that many kids have. Because in spite of the fact that the acquisition of reading skills goes fairly well, fairly smoothly, almost without a hitch for maybe half of kids, the other half are going to have struggles to one degree or another, ranging from mild to very severe, with the severity then impairing their performance in almost all areas of schooling.
To the extent that they don't feel good about their performance, and that shame is associated with a certain kind of confusion, right? I mean, this process, this learn to read process, it brings forth a kind of confusion that's unique and different from the other kinds of confusions they encounter in their, spoken language interactions with people. It's different than their physical, somatic interactions with the world.
Well, it's a very different sort of task. And I think one of the things that, we are the beneficiaries at this point in time of an enormous amount of research into the act of reading and the acquisition of reading skills. And one of the things I think that's become a fairly established conclusion is that reading is not a terribly natural process. This is not like the acquisition of language, that we don't witness the same level of discomfort in preschool children around their language skills for the most part, because language, particularly conversational language, develops for the most part in the vast majority of children fairly naturally. We don't have to go around exerting a tremendous amount of energy to teach kids how to communicate with us and with each other. And so they do that. And now, of course, there are always exceptions. Kids with speech difficulties and whatnot might have some very real issues around that. But for the most part, we don't see that. Reading is not as natural a process as it was once thought to be.
You hold you right there and say as natural. What about it is natural? I mean, you said it's not terribly natural, it's not as natural, but
Mm-hmm.
my sense is it's radically unnatural. I don't know how
Well, you could
we
look
can
at
bring
it.
our
I mean,
adjectives.
I think that's probably fair, given that human beings were around for a fairly substantial period of time before the development of print, and that in itself tells us the fact that it's not just something that comes with part of the biological package.
Right, and the unique code processing
That's
challenges
right.
of the English language is only 500 years old.
That's right. Yeah.
And
So
only, 10 generations, 20 generations have been doing it. So,
yes, it is. I mean, it's interesting. I probably, I'd say actually in contrast, it's interesting that we ever did assume that it was a natural process and that basically all we needed to do is provide structure and guidance and exposure to print and reading would happen. Well, we know in fact that reading doesn't happen for a pretty substantial number of kids. Now, for whatever reason, there are a substantial number of kids that seemingly regardless of what approach is taken, how careful we are, how careless we are, they learn to read. So put them in a room with books, a little bit of instruction and guidance, and they're fine. But on the other hand, we also have a very substantive number of children that experience, mild to moderate difficulties in ways that impact their emotional development, their school performance, and it would seem that based on what we know now that when these deficits begin and are entrenched early on, they're very difficult to undo. The longitudinal studies that we have regarding the evolution of reading development suggest that if you're substantially impaired in first grade, you're very, very likely to be substantially impaired in fourth grade. And if that's the case in fourth grade, you're probably looking at a school history of academic failure to one degree or another. So it's a fairly depressing, picture, when looked at in that light.
doesn't necessarily tell us much about what's necessarily so in the development of an individual child, but rather the probabilities of the entire pattern of home,
That's
school, and world that contribute to making it very difficult for a child that has that difficulty to escape that trajectory.
Exactly. Right. No, it doesn't really illuminate the specific parameters that really contribute to that picture.
Because we another tack, we kind of know that we can help 95% or more of all the children that are struggling.
Absolutely.
If we met them with what they needed.
Right. That's the encouraging thing, that at this point in time, we know a great deal more, for instance, about how to identify kids who are likely to be at risk. So we know what the early markers of reading failure are. We know how to track those systematically, which gives us really critical information so that we can adjust instruction for kids as they proceed through school and not document their failure at the end of the year. So but we have access now to very good continuous performance measures that give us the kind of information we need if we're going to adapt instruction for children and make it responsive to their individual needs rather than just offering them a package of instruction and essentially saying, good luck. We'll check at the end of the year to see if you're doing okay.
And when we say individual needs.
Something.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Okay.
It's a great picture, but I'm got that much.
Yeah, that's okay. They're not my kids.
Okay, great.
When we say individual needs, there's a distinction or a big difference between being in some kind of contact with the individual child and having some prolonged assessment of actually meeting them, actually connecting with them, in being in sync with them as they struggle from the inside out in this challenge, and what we're calling individual needs as it fits over our statistical models of the aggregate population. Right? I mean, so what we're talking about is still statistical approximations of individual needs for the most part.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's and that model and that conversation exist in part because of the structure of public schooling. The fact is that most elementary school teachers, depending on whether they're in states that support reduced classroom sizes, are going to be confronted with providing instruction for between 25 to 30 children. And at that level, it's often, difficult to have the sort of individual relationship that you would want to have, for instance, with a student who was beginning to struggle and have difficulty. Given that scenario and the limitations on resources that I think are likely to continue, possibly even worsen, I think we're forced to adopt statistical models for when to implement preventative measures, for trying to do the absolute best that we can to reduce reading failure from the outset. And we know there's, again, a fairly substantial volume of literature in remedial and special education suggesting that remediation is really not the ideal way to go. The early prevention of failure is absolutely critical. And we know a little bit more now about what we need to do if we want to try to remediate students who are failing, for instance, say at second and third grade. But the level of effort and the intensity of effort needed at that point is considerable, and often, in all honesty, beyond the resources of many districts to provide to individual students. Very difficult because of the fiscal constraints. So we get back to looking at what can we do to, as soon as possible, determine when a student is going to be at risk for reading failure and intervene in the most effective and efficient way. And then, obviously do what we can for those students that, that don't respond and that we know are experiencing not just academic failure, but emotional trauma as well.
Excellent. Let's take another step into the emotional piece. Did you have a chance to, or have you ever been exposed to the affect work? I think I may have asked you this on the phone. Like the interview with Nathanson, we talk about the compass of shame and affect.
I'm not that familiar with that, in all honesty, so it's something I probably...
How about this track? If a reader's struggling and their mind is trying to catch and stay entrained in the cognitive processing that's associated and necessary with reading this code, and their frustration with it and their confusion with it leads to the emergence of them feeling ashamed of themselves or feeling bad about themselves, feeling anything. Their consciousness is splitting. What they're processing is no longer the self-transparent code work. It's now involves themselves in a way. That's right. The moment that it starts to involve themselves, it's draining the brain capacity to work the code.
Absolutely.
So that this leads to a kind of a downward spiral. The more that they become self-conscious in the reading, the harder the reading.
Absolutely.
The harder the reading, the more self-conscious. And poof.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you've got a particular language for describing that space?
You've described it very nicely, I think. Basically, it's a very maladaptive feedback cycle that you approach a task with anxiety because of concerns about your own performance. That distracts from your attention, your ability to focus on and process the information that's being provided, which impairs your performance more, which increases your anxiety, and this cycle continues to amplify itself. And I think that is, what becomes then inappropriate behavior, intentional tuning out, doing anything that you can so that you give the appearance that either I don't care about this or this isn't an important activity. Don't try to tell me this is important. I know it's not important because I'm not doing well at it and I'm never going to do well at it. And if I acknowledge its importance, I would just have to sit here and be sad. Now, we don't work that way as human beings. We don't acknowledge these sorts of things. We have all these wonderful defenses that we put into play, which unfortunately many times don't serve us very well. But we can see those at work all of the time. Now, and it's very clear when you work, for instance, with students that have experienced more than a little reading failure, we know that one of the most important things that struggling readers can do as they begin to acquire the code is to read more. And one of the most difficult things to get them to do is to read more. How do we defeat that cycle? And it's a very, very difficult. I mean, there are all sorts of products out there to try to get kids to read more, and not just to acquire reading, but one of the things I think that it's quite possible that there's less awareness of is that once you're in the years of public schooling, reading isn't just about the acquisition of information. It also becomes the principal gateway for the acquisition of new language, for vocabulary, which places, when not acquired, which places this ceiling, a very real ceiling on your performance in almost all content area subjects. And this means that not only can't you decode the message yourself, you can't even participate in the discussion because you don't know the language. Because new language is acquired through exposure to print. Multiple exposure to words builds vocabulary. As vocabulary grows, you enhance your capacity to participate in all of this content area discussion. Science, social studies, history. All of this is going around you now, and you're increasingly being left out. If you're not even if you're a non-reader, if you're a poor reader, if you're a kid who chooses not to read, if you're the kind of youngster that is never going to pick up a book and is going to put it down as soon as you can after someone puts it in your hand. So once again, you see the cycle kind of builds on itself.
Right. I mean, it seems that because of the way we socially pressure the importance of reading, rightfully so, although I think it's a good case to argue for how we contextualize it all for children, but it is important. It's life critical. Children that don't get to a certain level of transparency, where the writing and reading processes is, second nature to speaking and listening. It's just another mode of language exchange. If they don't get to that, then not only are they not enabled to participate in that world that goes with it, they've been harmed.
Definitely.
Right? And when we look at the, NAEP, right? I say 64% of the 12th graders nationally in this country are below proficiency in reading.
Right.
84% of African American children.
Yeah, that's a pretty damning statistic.
Yeah. Once you consider proficiency as
Right.
being transparent,
Right.
as opposed to basic, which means instrumental, I can read the instructions, but I don't want to read.
That's right. And there's a huge difference between just being able to decode the text and being a more active and engaged reader. And essentially, to participate fully in most of the benefits that this culture offers, you have to reach that stage of proficiency. And if you don't, it closes a lot of doors. Now, that's not to say that nobody's ever done well. But
only so many people can be football, baseball, or music stars, right?
But the options are increasingly limited. And for any argument that we can make about the fact that it might not be absolutely essential, the question I always ask is, if we were talking about your child and you had to make the choice, I mean, I think it then becomes very obvious. Yes, I want my child to be proficient, no doubt about it. And so at the level, when we introduce that level of questioning about it, it becomes apparent, I think. If that's the way we're going to respond to that question with respect to our own child, then that's the answer. That's what we want. We want proficiency for our children.
So if we want proficiency, and clearly most of the children, I mean, even if you discount that pretty radically, you're still on the other side of most of the children are not proficient.
That's right.
Right? Most of the children aren't proficient. And the psychological consequence, to some degree or another, is that it's damaging their sense of themselves to not be proficient.
Right.
So the process of teaching children to read is teaching most of our children to have a problem with themselves, to not feel good about who they are as mental beings.
I think it's more than we might like to acknowledge. And I mean, I would be a little bit cautious about indicating that would apply to all of the kids who aren't proficient by the time they're seniors in high school, because there may be kids who feel during the early stages that they're sort of doing okay. They may not be, definitely on a trajectory toward proficiency, but they may not see themselves as kids who are failing at reading. That's a little.
But is that because they're really not, or is that because they've adapted one of the shame aversion strategies you were talking about that's covering it?
Well, I think they're relying on their environment to tell them about whether they're being successful or not. I mean, we could actually probably, there are strategies that we could use to make kids feel better about themselves, even though their proficiency wasn't increasing at an absolute level. I mean, we could try to mask, our evaluation of them. We could free them from the sort of evaluative components, but it wouldn't really help them to be more functionally, proficient. And so I think one of the really difficult things to balance is, as you said, the culture places a tremendous amount of importance on these skills. And that's obviously going to be reflected operationally in the way that schools function and operate. And it's very, very hard to mask that. But it does bring up a very interesting question, which is how can we, support kids during the initial stages of acquisition, particularly kids who are more likely to struggle, and help them as much as possible instructionally and B, effectively as well, so that they don't get turned off to this process.
Which means that we've got to contextualize it in such a way that they, especially the ones we know are going to struggle based on where they are, that we let them know they're going to struggle. We help them appreciate the fact that this is unnatural, that this is going to be a struggle. We're going to help you through it. And we try to detox the shame-prone response that can come with this struggle.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that an important kernel there is that we, the instructors, and don't treat all children as though this is a natural process and everybody should be coming along just fine. We acknowledge the fact that this is going to be pretty difficult for some folks, and that even though it is, there are a lot of things we can do to get through it. And a lot of good teachers do this. I mean, they're sensitive to this, and they try to, let kids know that, with additional effort, with additional assistance, that they can be successful too, but that it may not be as easy for them.
Right. Well, I had this conversation with James Wendorf, who's the director of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. And I like to kind of bring its triangulation into this zone, which is that if on the one hand, we're saying we got this profound crisis with reading, he says that, I mean, everybody says that, right?
That's pretty.
The majority of our children are less than proficient. For children that are less than proficient at reading, given the enormous social pressure context on it, they're not. The only way they can feel good about it, about not being proficient, is if they're one of the rare ones that are emerging in art or sports. Or music, or they found some other way to feel great about themselves, like reading doesn't matter. You see the little kids, like you were saying, we talk to little children that are struggling with reading, and it's not important. They said it's not, reading's not important. Right? Or I'm stupid, or I just can't read that well.
That's right.
Various ways of formulating a off-putting protective membrane against how they'd feel if they thought it really was vital and important.
Right. Yeah, all different coping mechanisms to handle with that
those
base.
Coping mechanisms aren't healthy.
No, not particularly. Well, not in all respects.
Okay, all right.
but they're probably helpful in I mean, they're adaptive responses. They're probably not going to be useful in terms of helping you overcome your skill deficit, but they're going to help you momentarily cope with the way you feel. And human beings are fairly well programmed to be very responsive to immediate needs. And we usually think a lot more about how we're feeling right now than about how proficient we're going to be 5 or 6 years from now.
For most of our evolution, there wasn't anything but now.
Yeah, that's right.
So organism is now oriented.
Now is a very critical and important moment for us. So you see these adaptive things, and it's not as though they're There are awful things that are happening. That
No,
happen
I
to
understand
these,
that there are organismically intelligent, adaptive strategies for dealing with this overwhelming feeling, and they're short-circuiting learning.
That's right. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that the attitudes and affect surrounding school instruction, reading, texts, and all of those things are very maladaptive for kids that begin to experience different levels of reading failure.
So my point is that when we look at this as a whole, if we look at the step back and look at the nation as a whole and all the children coming through it, and the recurring cooperative research on adult literacy problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that just only the National Institute for Literacy comes out 92 million. Everybody thinks, that's got to be nuts.
Right.
But subsequently, American Medical Association, Justice Department study after study after study comes back to say, nope, looks pretty close to the mark and maybe bigger than that. Right?
Pretty frightening.
Yeah, so a third of the adult population is reading below the 5th grade level and engaging in the correlation 70% on average in prison and health problems across the board correlates with reading.
Has an enormous
failure,
impact.
right? So we've got that big of with nearly $500 billion in expense associated with it, and then we've got these children coming through school in which we're saying most of them are less than proficient. And we know that it's got psychological consequences, and know that it connects to the 92 million on the stairway to the, through the 90, and all of this comes down to the process of learning to read for those people is creating a learning disability. Right? I mean, the greatest learning disability in this country is the process of learning to read.
That's probably reasonably accurate, right? I mean, I think we need to make a distinction between the folks that you've identified on those national assessments that are less than proficient and the students that the public schools formally identify as learning disabled.
Yes, I don't mean the neurobiological distinction that Congress has put forth in order to limit its liability exposure to spending money and so forth.
That's right.
But if we talk about it generally, if you look up learning disability in the general dictionary, not in the congressional definition for funding allocations, as this short-circuited disableness with respect to learning in certain domains or what have you, that the biggest, most common disability with respect to our capacity for learning in our society is the process of learning to read.
No doubt about it. And if you don't read proficiently, your learning is disabled to varying degrees. Again, this is
not only with respect to reading, but as you were saying before, it's with respect to vocabulary and to something deeper in central processing.
That's right. That's right. And while as a culture and as organizations, the government and schools are always probably going to insist on fairly discrete definitions of what is or isn't a learning disability, but we know good and well that this is a continuous distribution. And did I need to? I'm sorry, I thought that was a signal for something.
Oh, I was everything. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Excuse me.
Well, when we add this back, we say, on the one hand, we know 95% of the children could read if we met them the right way.
Yes.
There's only 4 or 5%, depending on which expert. It's not that we have any neurobiological evidence coming up from the bottom.
No.
We know from that apparently 5% we can't reach with our current thinking about how to reach them.
That's right. Yeah, that number might bounce around a little bit, but in general, the thinking is that roughly 5% of students, and this would not include students who are mentally retarded or have more serious
that were pre-screened
profound
coming into
disabilities,
this.
right? We're talking about the general population, that probably 5% of those students we would regard as relatively intractable in terms of their response to current interventions, regardless of level of intensity. So
inversely, 95% or so of the general population could read, despite the fact that we've got this huge problem. So we have to say something about how we're doing, how we're thinking about this, how we're teaching this is responsible for this massive expense and this massive replication of pain and suffering and disability in our population.
Absolutely. Now, again, I think there's a caveat there. I mean, we know that we can probably bring 95% of these students or take them successfully through the initial stages of code acquisition. And we know that when you don't, again, we've talked about earlier that when that code acquisition process doesn't go well, that it then impairs your acquisition of advanced language skills and reasoning and acquisition of content area information. So we know that we can at least, with the right sorts of approaches, the adequate approaches, adequate intensity, because there are a number of variables involved, that we could take 95% of our kids to the point where they could at least begin to participate in that process that involved language acquisition, information acquisition, and then fluency with all of these with content area materials. So. We have a long way to go.
Yeah, I'm not trying
in
to pin it on schools or teachers or parents or any one thing. I was going to say that as a society,
right,
it is our ignorance and our negligence that's perpetuating a relationship between children and this code and how we teach them to get into it.
Absolutely.
It has this massive implication that most of us aren't paying very much attention to.
Right. Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And it is. It's a complex interaction between what's provided at school, what the child brings to school, their language backgrounds, the amount of emphasis in the home that's placed on reading and the importance of reading. So there are a lot of factors there, but I think you're right. And one of the things that just as a practitioner at the ground level in the public school system, watching kids longitudinally, watching what happens to kids that don't learn to read well, that are less than proficient, I'd say I, not you, I've often wondered, I mean, why don't we just stop everything when kids aren't learning to read? I mean, why are we even doing anything else when kids don't master this process? Why doesn't the red light start flashing immediately and say, wait a minute, we're not moving on. We're not going to treat this as though it's some sort of a small problem that we can solve by just sending you over here for a few extra minutes a day and possibly monitoring your progress a little bit more closely, maybe not, and hoping for the best. Why aren't we pulling out all the stops and saying, wait a minute, you know what, if you don't learn to read, there are so many disastrous consequences. I mean, it would not be a good idea for kids never to get their early grounding in science or social studies. But I don't know that the life consequences would be anywhere nearly as dramatic as they are for kids that don't learn to read. And but it's
beautiful. I mean, I like what you're saying. I think it's great. There ought to be an emergency stop, red alert. We got a problem here. No, we ain't going anywhere till we do something about it. I think that's right on.
But that's really not the response that we have. And again, that's not a choice typically made by an individual principal, by an individual teacher, by an individual parent. It's almost as though that the system kind of imposes this limited solution on children and saying that, when you have difficulty with reading, this is the way we're going to respond to it.
Right, but look what the stats are adding up to about how effective this is.
Right.
And what we were saying before about science and these other things, sure, we want kids to understand that, but the self-reflective, abstract capacity to do that well is built in the reading process.
Right.
Right. The vocabulary to engage in that is built in the reading process.
It's built into the reading process, and if you don't learn to read, ultimately your acquisition of science information, historical information, political science, you name it, is all going to be extraordinarily limited by that.
Yeah, so your ability to participate in the world, to have a good job, to understand science, to understand the complexity of the world you're in, how you feel about yourself, all comes down to how well these children engage and survive and thrive through learning to interface with this few hundred-year-old technological contrivance, a code.
Right. Absolutely. That's it. I mean, cracking that code to gain access to these stores of information is absolutely critical. I mean, the code's a marvelous thing. it really allows us to, in a very simple way, to store and codify enormous amounts of information. But if you can't access that information because you don't know the code, then you're also excluded from the incredible resource that code's provided us with.
And back to your emergency stop for a second.
Mm-hmm.
By failing to do that, then we're putting, it's like we're allowing them to sink deeper and deeper and deeper into being able to see the daylight, in the sense that the further behind that they are and that we don't pull the stop,
mm-hmm.
the curriculum starts to get more and more complex and more dependent on their ability to read. So if they're having any kind of emotional things, or they're having any kind of struggle with respect to this, it's going to get harder and harder and harder.
Absolutely. And we know that that's, I think, really a logical conclusion that you would draw just from looking at the way schooling tends to proceed and the demands that are placed on kids and what they're asked to do. We also know from some of the more fine-grained remediation research that the longer we wait, the harder it is to make up these deficits as the kids slip behind in this language acquisition process. One of the measures that becomes least responsive to intervention is reading fluency. And part of I think one of the better current understandings is that fluency is limited because of the amount of new vocabulary that occurs in text as you go on, and because your limited exposure to text as a moderately impaired reader has limited your exposure. You need anywhere from 3 to half a dozen exposures to a word before it becomes part of your sight vocabulary. That affects your fluency. So the bottom line is, you're a stumbling reader, you don't like to read, you don't read, and again, we're back into that negative feedback cycle.
There's
right?
also the processing ecology of what's generating this virtual reality experience to begin with, taking the code and constructing internally recognizable word representations.
Right.
If that isn't happening fast enough,
that has to happen with incredible automaticity. It doesn't just happen. Rate affects very much not only interest in reading, but it also affects reading comprehension. So if you are, we know that if you're, for instance, even if you're able to decode relatively accurately, but that process is time consuming, that impairs your comprehension because you're devoting too much of your cognitive processing space to decoding the text rather than working with the linguistic aspects of the text and trying to comprehend it.
Being transparent to the meaning, and you're
That's
dealing
right.
with the meaning like you're dealing with it in a conversation. Yeah.
Very different. Oh, sorry. They are creeping up there.
Tell me about the unique perspective of school psychologists, yourself, and also of an organization like the organization that you're involved in, what your role is in that. And
okay.
How is it that they're getting it? You just said there should be an emergency stop, right? Well,
right.
Somebody's got to advocate for that. Somebody's got to make the value case for that. Somebody's got to say, look, this is going to save us dollars. It's going to save us lives. Somebody's got to put together the compelling argument that actually gets traction and makes a difference there. And it seems to me that it would be your profession, your group, your people that were saying, look, this is hurting these kids.
Right.
Fundamentally. We got to stop and rethink this. How is it that school psychologists are participating in this conversation we're having?
Well, they participate in this conversation on a number of different levels, individually and organizationally, and certainly now the national organization has become increasingly active in looking at reading failure as a very important phenomenon in schools and trying to provide more training for their member practitioners to become more knowledgeable about systems and individual responses that can assist children that are having difficulty with reading. I think one of the things that's been a very an ongoing process in school psychology is a slow, gradual shift toward looking at systemic responses to reading failure. And I think professionally, this has been something that I've been involved with in trying to promote in my state organization, in my school district. I don't remember exactly when the light went on for me, but it seemed that a number of years ago, and fairly early in my career as a school psychologist, I began to be fairly frustrated with the process of responding to difficulties in this area individually, one child at a time, because it didn't seem to matter how well I assessed the student's deficits and what sort of interventions I could propose. It was time to move very quickly on to the next child. It wouldn't be unusual, for instance, for a school psychologist to see over 100, sometimes as many as 150 students a year for assessments and evaluation of their performance. At that stage, it begins to be like thumbing through a deck of cards very rapidly. It's like you get a very quick, brief look, and yet. And also, one of the things is that the structure of the profession, at least initially, was such that almost all of the attention was focused on the child. So there's a child experiencing reading failure, a teacher or a parent asks for a meeting to discuss this and determine whether or not the child might be eligible for special education or some sort of other additional form of help that might be available. And almost always, immediately the focus is on the child. Well, what are the child's deficits? We run out and we start to measure intelligence, vocabulary, reading fluency, all of these. Some of these things may well be worth measuring and may well provide useful information, but it's interesting that the vast majority of the assessment that occurs is focused almost entirely on the child. So the failure is localized at the level,
there's something wrong with them.
as if there's something wrong with the child, and only with the child,
rather than the
as
child
though there
being
might not be
reflection
something
of
wrong.
This whole system,
right? With the system, with the curriculum that the district's chosen, with the way that the instruction is delivered in that particular classroom, with the way the parents have responded to the student's failure. There are all of these other parties that share a role in shaping this child's behavior, and that's not to suggest that it's necessarily productive or useful to point fingers at anyone, but it's certainly unfair to assume that all of the responsibility for that failure rests on that child's head. The person least equipped to bear the responsibility for that and least able to adapt to it. Now, again, and it's not like we assess children and run in and say, whoa, this is what's wrong with you, by the way, Johnny. We talk about this as adults, but we do respond to kids that way systemically, as though they are the problem. Now, there have been large-scale attempts to alter this in a number of different states to develop problem-solving sort of assessment systems, to look at instructional support systems, and to look more broadly, well, what is the character of instruction being provided in that classroom? What sort of progress are most kids making? What isn't being done there that's in reasonably good agreement with evidence-based or research-based instruction in this area? What are we not doing in terms of the intensity of our response to this child? So that is a sort of very lengthy answer to both, the individual response as a school psychologist and an organizational response. And I know both our state association and the national association have definitely, through their publications, through their workshop and training agendas, tried to support school psychologists in working across levels. So not just at the level of the individual child, but at the level of the system, and trying to help that system identify ways that they can serve kids more effectively. By adopting things like school psychologists, for instance, are in an excellent position to provide support to schools that want to implement school-wide monitoring and early assessment systems that identify very early on deficits in critical skills that we know are related to reading acquisition, like phonological awareness, and then to provide help with with interventions that address those deficits.
Thank you. It's very helpful. Has either the national or your association endeavored? I mean, we have a social education challenge, right? I mean, ultimately, for the most part, our parents and teachers don't understand the nature of this challenge sufficiently to be meeting children appropriate to their needs within it. I mean, some people are all up in arms that the whole problem comes down to the colleges of education and the way that we train teachers and the inertia in the teacher world. Others would say, well, the teachers are just struggling with the mess that's in the code. You know, we could go to that. We could go all over the place here.
Right.
But it seems like at some point we got to collectively get together and help teachers and parents understand the nature of this challenge, so that they're relating to the child in a new way that as the child's struggling with it. Has there been any kind of teach the teachers or educate the educators initiatives from the psychological community that's trying to help teachers get the enormous psychological implications of this reading challenge?
I think to some degree, yes. Yeah, I don't know that it's been articulated in exactly that way, but I think that there are attempts to provide information through a variety of sources, whether it's through training school psychologists to then provide in-services to teachers, or whether it's provided directly to teachers or to parents. I know the national organization, for instance, has materials that we distribute that are materials to distribute to teachers, materials to distribute to parents, that address different aspects of academic failure, response to academic failure, and particularly to early reading difficulty and intervention. I think one of the things that's made it difficult for us to have this conversation is that somewhat tragically, educators have been embroiled for a very lengthy period of time arguing about how to best teach reading. And often our methodological differences have prevented us from acting cooperatively in children's best interest. Putting aside these differences, it's been very difficult. Reading is a very politicized activity in schools, so much so that oftentimes it's difficult to even have conversations about it in certain contexts, because the feelings run so high that if the conversation begins to take this, then what you're telling me is that I'm going to have to probably teach in this way or that way, or you're telling me as a principal that I couldn't promote this particular style of approach to reading, and that would be extraordinarily unacceptable. And I think that we're working individually and organizationally to get beyond that, to get beyond the classic. 30, 40 years ago, it was phonics versus Dick and Jane. Later, it became whole language versus structured phonics instruction, and that we're trying to kind of move beyond that, and hopefully we are at a point where we won't let those sorts of differences be the factor that keeps us from acting cooperatively to avert a crisis, and to blunt our response to the amount of reading failure that we see occurring in schools.
Excellent. Okay.
Let me get a sip of water.
Sure,
Yeah.
please go for it. Good. All right. Well, this has been wonderful. It's covered most of the things that I'd hoped to get out.
You feel like you got what you need?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I really appreciate your respect. You come across great. There's been
Okay.
some fantastic tools popping through.
Good.
Is there something in our remaining few minutes that we didn't touch on that you think is important that we should?
Not really. I mean, we covered an awful lot of territory. I think that, and I like the fact that you gave me the opportunity to, because to me, one of the big things really is this, is let's acknowledge that we have a crisis on our hands, and let's acknowledge how important this is. And it really isn't just schools. I mean, it's states as well. You have state departments of education dictating how much time can be spent on certain areas and what you can or can't do in response to this sort of situation. Now, some states are responding more aggressively to reading failure than others. I know I do some work with the grant evaluation for the state of Texas, and they have built-in very highly structured requirements for how much time has to be spent on reading, and that's sort of a step in the right direction. But I think that one of the things that's exciting about what you're doing is that it's sort of like raising the kind of public level, of attention, and because you do wonder, what it would take when you go out of a meeting on an individual kid to say, like, do we realize that, what we're saying here is if this doesn't really speed up for this kid, what's ahead for him? What's ahead for him? A lot of failure, a lot of discouragement, a lot of being left out, and essentially denied access to most of what the successful people in the culture regard as the prizes of, participation in this culture.
Right. And even if we didn't care, and I'm aligned with you there. I care about what's happening to these children.
Right.
But even if I didn't care, and I was just concerned with how to harvest a better batch of bots. That's right. I'd still be.
You should be worried.
You should be worried.
You should be worried about the level of employees we're going to have in the future. You should be. I'm very concerned about the capability of people that are going to participate in our elections to be well informed.
Yeah, Tim Shanahan did an analysis of how many of
the
Florida ballots in the last presidential election were thrown out essentially because of reading errors.
Right.
Right. And it's much greater than all of the hanging chads and everything else put together. The literacy had more to do with the election process than all the rest of the stuff we're screaming about.
Yeah.
It literally. We can make a case. This is $500 billion a year.
It's an enormous amount of money. The impact is absolutely huge.
So we've got to make a case and build a standard reference that people can't escape from.
Right.